scenarios that one might come across, the various strategies that one could adopt in these scenarios, and then answering this sort of cheesy question of to post-edit or to not post-edit, to PE or not to PE. This then leads into a post-editing task that we're suggesting we'll all work on together to really solidify what we learned and challenge some of the assumptions that we have about post-editing in terms of how long it would take and the quality that we would derive from post-editing. But first of all, to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of terminology, we might ask, what is post-editing? So we've adopted some academic definitions that we see quite have taken quite a hold in industry as well, and it's a way that we can communicate a lot with industry practitioners, adopting this idea of post-editing as correction of texts that have been translated from a source language into a target by a machine translation system, any type of machine translation system. We'll talk briefly about MT just so that we're on the same page a little later. But in a sense, this post-editing then can mean tidying up raw output, correcting mistakes, revising parts of a text, or even retranslating the entire text if it's deemed not to be of good enough quality. In terms of translating and post-editing as different skills, we look at post-editing as a very transferable skills, especially in terms of language and general translation skills, in terms of looking at strategies of pre-editing. So in post-editing, we will be able to judge whether it's worthwhile or not to post-edit content from MT. This is very similar to looking at pre-editing, let's say a source text that we would come across in regular translation. Also, skills in editing and proofreading are both in post-editing and in translation. And also because post-editing is so ingrained in technology workflows, we see that translators can learn quite a lot more about CAT processes, so CAT being computer-aided translation, especially then in looking at translation memories, and more specifically then at machine translation systems, what MT can and cannot do, and the different types of systems that one might encounter. In terms of industry then, there's quite a lot of data to support that it's a very marketable skill, whether it's something that one chooses to do more often than not, or once in a while, between projects or on the side. So there are these professional and personal questions that are really up to the practitioner, but in terms of bang for the buck, it might be worthwhile learning a bit more about post-editing, having these skills and using them either in post-editing or in general in translation. So now I'll hand over to Federico, who will give a bit more of a critical overview of post-editing itself.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Hello, everybody from me too. Thanks a lot to Lauren and Gala for hosting this webinar, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today. So, based on what Stephen has just said, I'm going to start by giving you a critical overview of post-editing. So, Stephen has already mentioned some of this. In order to maximize the success and the effectiveness of MT, we essentially have two main options. The first one consists in working on the input, on the source text, and familiar solutions in this case are, for example, controlled language, so imposing restrictions, constraints on the style of the source language that we use when writing the source text, or other approaches such as sublanguage, where using the language in a very specialized, very narrowly defined domain has the benefit of making the text easier to machine translate if our machine translation system is tailored to that domain. On the other hand, the opposite option, the one that we're going to talk about today, concerns post-editing the raw MT output. And this might, but does not necessarily need to be, combined, for example, with other strategies such as system customization. We're not going to talk about that because it's a fairly specific case, but we're going to discuss post-editing in more general terms.